This is the map we're going to end with, and I showed you this before. This is the map we're going to end with. The two dots are will be the the base areas, let's say, or the headquarters of the main combatants in the civil war that will follow. And the northern red dot there is Yan'an, and that's the central base area, not the only base area, but the central base area of the Chinese communists. And then the dot on the bottom is the city of Chongqing, or Chungking, like Chungking Express, which is now an administrative level, province level city, but at this point is part of Sichuan province. And that will be the wartime capital of the nationalists. And that will be the third capital during this period. Nanjing is the main capital. When Nanjing is lost, the formation of a second capital, Wuhan, which is lost, and then the capital is moved even further to the west to try to get out of the basically the reach of Japanese military in the city of Chongqing. This transition from informal empire to formal empire. There are mechanisms at work. There are these sort of secular trends which make this transition very, very likely. But when when we go back to the 19th century and with the rise of Japan, there is nothing written in any plan book that the ultimate goal. I mean, well, some wrote this, but for a great many informal imperialists, the idea of an extractive relationship with this weakened but still very profitable Qing empire was what we wanted as imperialists, and it's in many ways is what the British wanted, in many ways what the French wanted, and what the Americans wanted, and the Russians, and so forth. So how do we actually have to explain why this transition took place? And just to set the stage here, I want to show you a few quotes just to get you a sense of how people were thinking prior to this transition. So, a Japanese minister to England, 1899, saying, if the foreign powers partitioned China and acquired their own territory there, they would be merely increasing their expenditure to no real end, for their advantage would be no different than at present. You'd be making the same amount of money, but spending an ungodly amount more. So, direct rule is not advantageous. Indirect rule is the way to go. For that reason, this continues, nearly all the foreign powers are agreed that the status quo in China should be maintained, that no country should violate it, that China's independence should be maintained, and that these various powers' own interests should be maintained through the expansion of commercial rights in China's interior. And this is an important point here, that one of the peculiar features of imperialism and colonialism in the Chinese context was the sheer number of imperialists that in the mix. The where if we in order to we would need to go to the continent of Africa. So obviously not the empire of Africa or the country of Africa, but the continent of Africa, to approach the same number of imperial actors at play. In most contexts, there certainly are places that have more than one imperialist nation kind of in the works, and certainly many places where there are two or maybe three competing imperial powers for a particular prize. But in the context of the Qing, the number is really kind of mind-boggling. We saw this in the uprising, and in the Allied suppression of the Boxers. We've got Germans, we've got French, we've got British, we've got Russians, we've got Austrians, we've got Italians. I mean, when you got Italians, you got a problem, because they're not known for their empire building. And so and then you have the Americans nibbling at the corners with the Philippines and with Guam and so forth. And just the sheer number of players has led at least one historian to refer to China as a kind of hyper colony, like just many different actors. But one effect of this is that it made it effectively impossible for one to dominate per se, because kind of, again, somewhat along the lines of the Berlin Conference and the decision of the partitioning of Africa, there were these agreements between these different imperial powers to try to make sure that each one didn't infringe too much on each other's interests and did not take actions that would upset the boat. and throw the empire itself, the Qing Empire, into disarray, which in turn would have hurt everyone's bottom line, everyone's revenue. So that is a check on any one party's ambitions to gobble up too much territory, and we saw that in the Triple Intervention. We saw that after the Sino-Japanese War, when the three European powers forced Japan to give some pieces back to the Qing, not to them, but back to the Qing in order to maintain something. So as we move forward, though, it needs to be pointed out that with that China, or the Qing and then later China, was as important to Japanese empire, arguably, as India was to British empire, even more so. The British imperial portfolio, the French imperial portfolio, um, was larger, was more geographically spread out. It was more sort of diverse, uh, and the Japanese empire was the portfolio was entirely, almost, a question of China. Korea had been first taken into the sphere of influence after the Sino-Japanese War in 1910. It is formally annexed into the Japanese Empire, but even Korea is a bridge to Northeast Asia, to China, and to Manchuria. And so, and this passage here is an important one, where uh, we have this articulation of just how much more important China is to us, meaning Japan, than it is to any other actor in the field here. A civil war or collapse in China may not have any direct effect on other nations, but to Japan, it will be a matter of life and death. A civil war in China will immediately be reflected in Japan. And, excuse me, the downfall of China means the downfall of Japan. And so, increasingly, Japanese militarists, state planners, and others see the future, the future of the empire, and the very existence of the Japanese empire, as inseparable from the status of China, the stability of China, and also, as we will see, uh, Japan's ability to maintain its presence, its imperial presence, informal imperial presence in Northeast China. And then we're going to see why this becomes so webbed over time. But it will be, arguably, this quote is not an exaggeration. In many ways, it's true. And certainly by 1930s, this is actually true in terms of the way that Japanese empire has built itself. Okay, so here is an overview then of the major factors that's going to get us from informal empire to formal empire. One of them I've just pointed out. It's third on this list, that this increasingly webbed and inseparable relationship between Japanese empire and the existence of Japan, and then China and its Japan's ability to extract revenue from China, build infrastructure in China, grow into the direction of China, that is, into Northeast Asia. But as importantly, it's also a question of the rise of nationalism in two places: China and Japan. So I already alluded last week to this, but let me just underscore this: is popular nationalism, that is a sense of national identity, a sense of us versus them, a sense of even anti-foreignism, is a very different animal when it takes root and is articulated among non-elite laborers, peasants, workers, those who are not, studying abroad in Germany or studying for the civil service examination. This very rarefied group. We're talking about, you know, uh, coal miners, and we're talking about night soil collectors, and others. When something takes hold at a mass level, a popular level, of a nationalist view, then many of the strategies and techniques that have served imperialists up till this point, think back to the Opium War, don't work anymore. and I'll underscore this just again, and then I won't dwell on it because we already talked about it. If you have thousands of people in the street who are, boycotting Japanese stores or harassing Japanese store owners or burning down, or attacking Japanese consulates, it doesn't matter a whole lot if the Japanese military, makes its way up the bay, the Bohai Bay, to striking distance of the capital, and then say to the government, the Qing government, you have to come to the treaty. You've lost, checkmate. In popular nationalism, that popular nationalist can look at that chessboard and say, "That's a very interesting elite game you've got there," and then just toss the chessboard on the ground and go continue to burn down a Japanese store or harass a Japanese Buddhist monk or whatever it might be. And so from both the perspective of Japan and the perspective of the Chinese government, this is something beyond their control, using the means at their disposal that have been developed really since the Opium War. If you see what I'm saying. And so and all of these technologies of informal empire really have been about bringing uh, state leaders, emperors, the government to the peace treaty table and sue for peace. But this doesn't work when you're talking about mass nationalism. On the Japanese side, something that is often not remembered about Japan during this period is that the period of late 1920s, certainly the 1930s, is a period of the implosion of civilian government and basically the rise of a more or less a military coup d'état against the civilian government. A civilian government still exists, but this is a period, especially the 1930s, of profound political violence. Some people refer to it as the politics of assassination, and there is the rise in the 1930s during the Great Depression of a deeply nationalist, jingoist, militarist, racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-elite sort of fervor that emerges, especially in kind of the junior officer class of the Japanese military, and some of the sort of soldiery and some high-ranking military officers that see the civilian government as, in essence, an impediment. And we won't dive into this, but the 1930s witnesses the assassination or attempted assassination of a number of prime ministers, presidents of Japanese banks, major presidents of Japanese corporations. It's a period of just profound domestic violence, and the rise of the basically Japanese military control over the mechanisms of what should be, in theory, civilian government. This is the framework for this, and then the last piece of the puzzle here, which is mainly about 1937, but is 1932 also has an issue here. The assumption that the military operations that are being contemplated in 1936 and 37 are going to be short-term, punctuated, rapid, almost like large-scale police actions, rather than something like, this is not uh, the invasion of Poland. This is not marching through Belgium. This is not the launch of a war of conquest. That is not how 1937 is conceptualized by Japanese military planners. And we're gonna see this. So there's an assumption, a sort of the short war thesis, which has served humanity so well for so long that. Okay, and then just I won't dwell on this, but you see that this is Chinese, the popular Chinese nationalism, something that we've discussed. I won't dwell into this, except to point out this bottom piece. I don't have the exact figure, but by the turn of the century, by 1900, there are approaching 100 different treaty ports. The foreign population in China is still small, but the the possible points of contact between everyday Chinese people and one or another foreign national is just exponentially higher than it has ever been before. Uh, this is there's just there's just so many possible nodes and connections in this context, and so that's going to be very important here because it just raises the possibility for altercations, for harassment, for the outbreak of violence between not again not Japanese and Chinese state leaders, but just an everyday Japanese businessman who's living in Shanghai and an everyday rickshaw driver who is just these points of contact are going to grow exponentially as compared to anything we've ever seen in the past.